All right, everyone. Donald Trump is in a little bit of hot water right now for something that I personally fully support, and that's a virtual elimination of the Drug Control Policy Office. This is sort of both addiction treatment and an extension of the drug war. I think I would eliminate it completely because the federal government doesn't need to have a drug policy. The very idea of a drug control policy at the federal level goes against everything we were founded as a nation to represent. That is, there never should have been a drug war. There never should have been the banning or even licensing of substances for adults to put in their bodies. DUI and public intoxication and stuff would still apply, obviously, because those can be harmful to the rest of the community. But if a person is using drugs, my feeling is still that we should get them addiction treatment, try to get them cleaned up and sober. When a person's addicted, they're no longer really capable of fully making choices, almost a chemical violation of the NAP, if you would term it that way. And I have no problem with society paying for addiction treatment because it's a hell of a lot cheaper. It's a hell of a lot easier. It requires far less bureaucracy. This has already been shown around the world where it's been implemented, where there's mass decriminalization. We've got it here. We have a huge opiate problem in the state of Vermont. Weed was decriminalized. We don't really have a problem with that, despite the fact that that was years ago. The usage rate really isn't any higher here. You look at Colorado or Washington State, there's no firm evidence to suggest that there's been any real social problem created by the legalization of marijuana. In fact, I believe it was just legalized here. I know the House was considering it. I think New Hampshire did as well. And I see that as a good thing. The government doesn't need to be involved in this. Simply slashing the Bureau is, though, at least a good start. Trump's talking about a 95% cut to the office. And some people are rambling about this. The right wing is saying, oh, well, this means we won't be able to wage this limitless drug war and ruin lives. That's a horrible thing. We got to think of, like, sober Jesus Christ or something like that. And people on the left are like, oh, this means less money for addiction treatment. No, it doesn't. Transfer that to the states. Let them handle it. They can handle... The situation with addiction is different from state to state. The federal government can only get in the way and cause more problems with trying to take care of that stuff. The states need to handle it. If the federal government wants to disperse some degree of funding to the states to help prop up their idea of addiction treatment, that's fine. The federal government shouldn't be lending a penny to enforcement of the drug war, because the drug war shouldn't even be going on. I think the left, in criticizing this, is shooting themselves in the foot. They've made the argument, oh, well, we shouldn't be just like throwing addicts in prison and stuff. And yet they want to keep funding a policy office that's partially responsible for continuing to do that. You should be like sucking Trump off right now if you're on the left for suggesting this. As for the right, isn't this going to help you cut taxes at least a little? There's your funding for the wall or something like that. Wouldn't that be generally a good idea? The way that we're going to solve the drug problem in the United States, if you can even call it a problem that wasn't spawned by Uncle Sam's crappy policies in the first place. Step one is decriminalize these substances so that people will feel, safe in getting addiction treatment. They don't think, oh, well, if I go get this and it goes, people know that I'm using heroin or something, I might get profiled by the police and dragged off to jail if I relapse or something like that. Number two, vastly decrease spending on like drug enforcement and put that in addiction treatment so you can get them, the help that they need. You'd have those shots they give people now when they're overdosing on opiates and things of that nature. That would save a lot of lives. It'd also save a lot of money. It's a hell of a lot cheaper than sending a SWAT team to someone's house at midnight to kick in their door and throw in a bunch of flashbangs and drag them off for the crime of oh, they snorted a line of cocaine or they have a bong or something like that. Oh, they had they had an ounce and a half of marijuana instead of just under an ounce, and so they must be dealing it. It's retarded. It doesn't work. Here's the big thing though. When we look at these things, we're looking at decades and decades and decades of evidence when we're talking about the drug war. We're looking at half a century of solid evidence, and it hasn't worked. Addiction has not dropped. The number of overdose deaths has not dropped. Both of these things are rising up. We look back further at Prohibition, we see the same thing. Prohibition gets enacted, and all of a sudden a population that could purchase safe alcohol, generally speaking, it was mildly regulated at the time. They could get their alcohol. If they were injured, there's a bad batch of moonshine or something, they can sue for being injured or killed or whatever. Whereas their families would be suing if they die from poisoned alcohol, of course. And you go from that, you go from something where you're capable of protecting people to turning it into a black market where it's run by the fucking mob. And so there's no legal recourse. People very quickly get tired of it and don't want to enforce it anyway. It's starting to happen now, especially with marijuana in some of these states. What do you think is pressuring them to legalize it, or at least to decriminalize it? It's the fact that there's no longer a will in the population to enforce such stupidity, at least with marijuana. I extend this to all drugs. I think if someone is doped up on heroin, we should be putting him in rehab. For the hard drugs, we need to create 3 new classifications of drugs. We need to have those drugs that are going to be openly discouraged for use. Stuff like heroin, crack. We know it's fucking bad for you. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure it out. Stuff like meth or something like that. People go to involuntary rehab if they're using it. That is, if the only enforcement is, yeah, you're going to rehab because we don't want people to be addicted to all this crap. That would be the first tier. Second tier would be stuff like the psychedelics and stuff like that. If you're wandering around on LSD in public, yeah, that should be considered. Potentially there's harm done in that situation. If someone's using it in their own home or whatever, you can crack down on manufacturing it if you want to, but it's still going to be here. And so since it is simple possession again, give them a fine, a slap on the wrist punishment or something like that, just to say you're doing something, so that the soccer moms don't whine about little Jimmy being exposed to like coke and acid tabs and stuff. And then for stuff like marijuana, some of the salvia, certainly, some of these more or less harmless substances, and yes, salvia divinorum, by the way, is classed with that. Very short period of action, very strong, but no specific literature suggesting that you can actually ingest enough to overdose and die on it. There have been some suicides linked with it, but they're tenuous at best, and that's about all you've got. Those things should be fully legal. Yeah, anyone who's 18 or up should be able to smoke weed. They can already, at a little higher in age, they can drink. They can smoke cigarettes till they get lung cancer. They can drink and get liver cancer, or go out and, speed off into a tree and kill a bunch of people. But they can't smoke marijuana, which doesn't impair them as much as alcohol and is nowhere near as addicting as tobacco. Here's the real problem. Because both tobacco and alcohol have remained legal, we can destroy the precedent of the DEA on both fronts with regards to its drug scheduling. Here you have tobacco, an extremely addictive substance. Long-term, very harmful. Short-term, not so much. In fact, mostly harmless in very small amounts, but extremely addictive. Tens of millions of people in the United States are addicted to tobacco. So if addiction is the problem, well, that's legal. As long as you're 18, that sort of degrades the DEA's argument. Alcohol, while less addicting overall, is even more harmful, causes a lot more impairment, is frequently linked to deaths in automotive and machine accidents and so forth. People, they get liver cancer. Very, very harmful to the body in more than moderate amounts. And yet that's legal. It's simply regulated. You got to be 21 to purchase it. You got to have a license to, brew it up. If nobody cares about your, little copper tubing array at home where you're making like 2 gallons of beer. Nobody fucking cares about that. But if you're going to manufacture and distribute it, you need a license and you need to have certain standards. And that's, by the way, that's fine with me. Including the libertarian part of me. And nobody wants, a dozen people to go blind from drinking, some sort of crappy-ass home brew or something. But that's what we should be doing as a society. Yeah, not only should we slash this agency, and I congratulate Trump for having the foresight to want to do so, we should eliminate it altogether. We should also prevent the DEA from making these wanton decisions. It's like, what was that one just recently? That wasn't Kava. It was one of these substances that people use to try to wean themselves off heroin. It's like opium light or something like that. I can't remember the name of it. They were scheduling that. They're like, oh yeah, it's massively harmful. It's a horrible thing. People are going to turn to the herbal world to try to beat addiction and a depression and stuff. The government hasn't made a proper mental health system. The drug war is a failure. And they don't have enough addiction treatment for people. No shit, people are going to self-medicate and try to fix the problem themselves. That's called they're independent, sovereign individuals. They should be doing that, because the government's not going to help them. And you wonder why they take all these weird substances. You wonder why there are synthetic drugs on the street that are 10 times worse than the natural drugs that they're trying to sort of mimic. You know, you've got Flacco or Ivory Mist or Spice or something. You wonder why they even are used. Well, it's because of your moronic drug control policies. I would slash the Bureau by 100% and just do away with it. I'd slash and burn the DEA's ability to even create drug policy. I wouldn't even have a drug scheduling system. Congress would create one simple bill that could be enforced. Most of these substances would end up being legal in small amounts. Those that aren't would result in a slap on the wrist fine or rehab. And it should be part of the medical infrastructure of the country. It shouldn't be part of the policing infrastructure of the country. As for the cartels, once you implement such a policy, their influence dries up. And they'll turn to other crimes, certainly. Yes, they'll be prostituting people or stealing cars or something like that. Running guns, something along those lines. Yeah, that's why you need the fucking border wall. I have no problem with that either. I think it's a good idea. It makes sense to have a coherent southern border defense. I'd say we should take a look at doing something on the northern border too. There are some drugs and problems that come across that. There are problems as well that come across into Canada from the United States. Nobody even wants to talk about that. It's just a little more difficult. I believe that the border is partially maritime and far larger. It might be difficult to fund a wall on the northern border as opposed to down on the border with Mexico. Or we could, preferentially, if we wanted to save more money, we could work on a joint drug control policy with Mexico and build a wall on their southern border. No, you really could. It's possible to do that. A lot of these people that are coming into the country illegally, and a lot of the cartel activity has nothing to do with like northern Mexico anyway. Yeah, it's where a lot of killings occur. It's coming from the Yucatan Peninsula. A lot of it is. And a lot of that coke and shit is coming from South America. Some of it's getting run up through Miami anyway. It's not even coming across the Mexican border. People don't even want to address that side of the drug control issue. It gets smuggled in our ports. It doesn't even come up through the border. They would prefer to walk it through a tunnel, I'm sure, but if they can pack it in a crate and smuggle it in on something that's labeled, a clown assembly or something like that, yeah, of course they will. That's almost as cheap. They bribe somebody at the port, and that's all they have to do. So I'm glad about this. I think it's a good idea. I think Trump should go further. You should smash and crash and slash through all of the drug control apparatus and let the states handle it. And states with sane drug control policies versus states with insane drug control policies will eventually open up a massive discrepancy in addiction and overdoses and cartel violence. And when people see the difference between these two, they'll be more receptive to sane drug control policies. It will still take time, but essentially when you have competition in policy between states, not handled or co-opted at the federal level, you have a miniaturized free market. Not completely free, but you have intercompetition based on policy. We see this with state taxes, certainly. There's a big difference between Texas, no income tax, low property costs and everything, and like New York City or California. Why do you think people go to fucking Texas in the first place? It's not just for the nice weather. Some of that has to do with their wallet. And so you have this competition, and people will migrate to places that are sane, leaving places that aren't sane to fucking wither. And the state governments there, when they see there's a problem, become more receptive to a sane policy. That's what we need to do. It's a states' rights issue. And it's an individual rights issue. Consenting adults should be able to ingest these drugs if they want, unless they're going out and crashing their car into things, or speeding through red lights at 100 miles an hour, or shooting people, unless they're committing some other sort of crime in association with their use of those substances, they should be free to use them. That's about all. Peace out.